This is the Unstarving Musicians Podcast. The podcast features conversations with musicians and music industry professionals, all intended to help musicians be better at marketing, business, the creative process, and all the other things that empower us to do more of what we love, make music. Hey, it's your host Robonzo here. Thanks for tuning in. If you're an indie music artist or fan, you're in the right place. Whoever you are, I appreciate you. As a gigging musician and fan of live music, I am committed to sharing my personal expertise with you. I'm also committed to learning about and sharing the expertise of other music professionals, which is what I do here on the podcast, extract that expertise. If you'd like to be privy to what I'm learning, hop over to unstarvingmusician.com and join the community. You'll get an email from me, usually weekly, with tips, tricks, insights, and secrets intended to make your music journey a little better and brighter. I'll never send you anything spammy, and you can unsubscribe at any time. If you'd like to support the podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, also known as iTunes. The podcast and this episode are powered by the Unstarving Musician's Guide to Getting Paid Gigs, How to Get Booked and Paid What You're Worth Over and Over Again. It was written by me, and it's available on Amazon, Kobo.com, and one day soon, Apple iBooks, when I can finally figure out how to publish it there. The book is also available as a standalone podcast called the Unstarving Musician's Guide Podcast. You can learn more about the book and the companion podcast at unstarvingmusician.com/book. I'd love it if you picked up a copy, and I'd love it even more if you left a review. Right! Roger Blevins Jr. is a singer-songwriter and vocalist for the Austin-based band Mingo Fishtrap. He is one of a few super talented people that Tom Meany has recommended for this podcast, Tom Meany being an ambassador for house concerts and a former guest of the podcast. Roger grew up listening to R&B. He went to school at the University of North Texas where he studied music, and I happen to know this is a great place to study music because I grew up playing music in Dallas-Fort Worth where many UNT students showcase their talent. This turned out to be a fantastic conversation. Roger talks about a songwriting group he's in. It is a group with a fascinating structure. The most important things he learned in music school, not what you might expect. Where he sees so many aspiring musicians struggle, how he's created a financially sustainable band, how his band has become heavily involved in the festival scene, and more. You get to hear the track Mason Jar by Mingo Fishtrap from their latest release On Time at the end of this episode, you lucky dogs. Here's me and Roger Blevins Jr. Roger, welcome to the show.
Thank you, man. Appreciate you having me.
I appreciate you taking time out to visit with me. So how do you and Tom Meany know one another? Is that actually from performing?
Yeah, well, we probably got to know each other through a thing that we both do called Songwriter University or Songwriters, which is kind of a really loose writing group. Ray Prim kind of took the reins where Bob Schneider left off and turned it into this digital world where you can basically submit all these tunes. Everybody listens to one another's tracks during the course of a week, and then they comment or give critiques or just kudos or whatnot. It's become a really cool thing. It's a very simple format, basically. Tom or whoever's leading the semester is what we call it now. That's not a prompt, and the prompt can be a single word or a phrase. And really the only rules are it's a 2-minute song at least, that there's some sort of accompaniment that goes along with it, and you record it. It can be a phone recording or a full-blown production or whatever. And it's really nice to have this. Peer pressure is probably too strong of a word, but this expectation, I think, amongst folks that and actually through the course of this, I've met quite a few people, and we've done some Songwriter nights here and there. We actually did a couple theater shows with some of the lineup. So, yeah, man, it's been a good thing. So that's kind of how we got to know each other really well. But I knew Tom a bit before that, just through performing and seeing some of the clubs around town.
Very cool. And for those of you who may be listening to this episode but have never heard the one with Tom Meany, he was a recent featured guest on the podcast. So if you want to know more about him, you can check him out. This is really neat. I'm so glad I asked you the question. So is Songwriters University an Austin thing, or is it bigger?
It's been based here, but we have folks all over the country now and a few folks abroad as well. I say we. It's not really we. It's a very, very loose thing. And it started with just literally probably 10 or 12 people at most. Most of us were in the Austin area, but because it's all done online, it can be anywhere. Now, I think this last semester, man, it started off with 60 people, 70 people, something like that. It was kind of nuts. It's really great. It's a good resource for beginning writers or folks that have never really had their material in any sort of forum to get some feedback and maybe learn a few tricks here and there, and folks that have been doing it for a while to kind of to have to write every week. It's really funny. We've been doing this for maybe, I don't know, 6 years, something like that. And I have written more in those 6 years than ever in my life, like by a long shot. I've got hundreds of songs now, well, probably close to 200 songs. I would say the vast majority, I like something about, you know what I mean? I mean, I like the whole thing, but there's something in those tunes. And for me, it was very valuable to kind of get my home studio set up in a very efficient way. That was one of my goals out of the thing for myself, was to every week to do a full blown production, like a full track. That kind of self-imposed thing basically made me, I'm sitting here right now, that's why I'm pausing, basically made me set up my studio to be the most efficient that I can possibly make it. So drums and everything's got its station, everything's always set up, so any idea that comes across my twisted mind can get down on tape, or tape, quote unquote, as quickly as it possibly can. So that's been a really great thing for me in that regard. Then out of that came quite a few more finished ideas than I would have had and not had that pressure.
That's so cool. And for anyone who's listening that is curious, is it open for people to inquire about or maybe be involved in? Or
I think it is. I think they're kind of imposing some number limits. Obviously, folks that are grandfathered in, because it becomes so nearly impossible to listen to everybody's track in the course of a week. You know, you can't listen. It's really tough to listen to 60, 70 songs in 1 week and provide any kind of feedback. So I think they're maybe keeping it. But, you know, the format, of course, is open to whoever. So you start this with a couple friends and you have this expectation. I'm actually in another group aside from that. I think Tom is as well. There are several of these, I think probably in every primary, secondary market. Just find a group of folks that want to do this thing and start it. We just submit links to SoundCloud or whatever. So there's nothing particularly difficult about getting started. And I think no matter where you are in your songwriting career, it's a very helpful thing to have that peer pressure. Very helpful to, it gives you one more incentive to push those ideas to the top and have them come into fruition.
That sounds so helpful. And you said currently Ray Prim is kind of managing the semester or the whole thing.
Ray, I don't think Ray did it last semester. I think he's coming back this semester. I'm not sure if we call him the professor. That's the person, whoever's leading, So it was Professor Prim was the first in this group. But then Tom kind of morphed it into the Songwriter University thing and made it a little bit more official. We have a hidden Facebook page. There's some things, when you have 60 or 70 people, another fringe benefit is you have people with all sorts of skill sets. So we have one guy who set up a page where we can actually submit these things with all the lyrics and
that's cool.
And so it's really kind of sparked a lot of other relationships and conversations beyond just simply writing, which is super cool. It really is pretty neat, and some friendships and some CD projects and some album projects as well.
That's amazing. So this sounds like a whole episode conversation. So I may have to follow up with you.
It really is. This started, going back further, I'm not sure if Bob Schneider started this group here in Austin, but this was 15 years ago probably. There was a small group, 4 or 5, maybe 7 writers that would get together physically every week. They get together at some guy's house or whatever, and they play a song for one another and discuss it and probably have a couple glasses of wine. And that's super cool too, obviously, but it's limiting in terms of geographical location and time and everything else. So this is a little bit more inclusive, I think, of different, not only where you are, but just different skill sets, where you might happen to be in your career. And it gives some folks who might not have that much experience a resource that they otherwise wouldn't have, and kind of a safe place to ask questions, I think. And like I said, for folks who have a little more miles on them, I guess, to just re-solidify what they're doing and to have that peer pressure. So, yeah.
How many years ago did you say you thought it started?
I think the original thing I want to say was over a decade ago, probably well over a decade ago, I'm guessing. And I don't know who all was in that group. I wasn't involved in that. But Ray came into that group, I think, towards the tail end of it. And then when that ended, he kind of started the online version of that, which was at the beginning when we first did this 6-7 years ago, we were just emailing tracks to the group, which it's a lot of data. So eventually that became, we submit SoundCloud links, and now it's that, but there's a little more. It's become a little bit more official. We have a little website that we can all log into. But the idea at its core is super simple. The other group I'm in, which is similar, we're still just emailing each other the tracks. That group's relatively small, 6 people, I think. and a little more loose. And I guess I forgot to mention, if you don't submit it, you're out. That's the pressure. Depending on the professor, they may be a little more lenient, but you have a week and you have to submit it by a certain time. And it's pretty structured in that way. And I think that helps a lot of creative types to have that expectation and that deadline. When you're doing something in the commercial world, whatever it might be, you have deadlines. And sometimes those deadlines are what forces that creative bit up to the top, and you have to get it out. So you're like, well, this isn't my favorite, but we got to finish it. And then by the time it's done, you might actually like it quite a bit more than you thought you might.
Yeah, oh, that sounds great. And it's funny, I was thinking as soon as you started talking about it, words like accountability had come into my head. And just now when you said that, I'm like, oh, it's kind of like a mastermind group in that way, or well-run one. Like if you're not there, you're out.
Absolutely.
Who is Bob Snyder?
Bob Schneider is a fairly well-known Austin musician. He's one of the more successful and kind of local hero type guys around here. Had a few kind of minor hits, I guess. I don't want to speak for him. I don't really know. I don't know where he started out, but he's had some relatively big successes in that front, and has had a career that he's lasted. See, I first saw him probably in the late 80s in a band called Ugly Americans, and they had their label deal and all that good stuff. And that band kind of morphed into a group called the Scabs, which was kind of a pop funk thing. They would play every Tuesday down here at Antone's. This is starting in the early 90s through most of the 90s, I think. And they would have 500 people packed, sometimes more than that, into a club. It didn't really hold that many. And that kind of launched him into a solo career. And yeah, he would be a great guy if you can get him to have, because he's, for being someone that not every household knows, he's had a very long career and has managed his success as well, it seems.
I think I found him. Does he have a release out called Blood and Bones? Do you know?
That sounds right. Yeah, sounds right.
Cool. Yeah, I see Bob Snyder in Austin. That's very cool. Yeah, thanks for telling me about him. Earlier in our conversation, I wanted to ask you, Roger, if you prefer to go by Roger Blevins Jr. or just Roger Blevins, and regardless of which one, tell me about Roger Blevins Sr.
Usually when it's marqued under my own name, which is not all that frequent, it's the Junior is on there. I guess it's just maybe it's Harry Connick Jr.'s fault. I don't know. My dad's a bass player. He's been a bassist really all of his life. He started making money and kind of helping to support his family by playing music when he was 12 or 13 years old in Louisiana. That was the natural progression of that, was that when I came into the picture, he was playing in Louisiana at the time in the 70s and 80s. Probably the most played music live was, they called them standards. That's what they called them back then. And that was really all R&B and soul music, maybe a little rock too, but a lot of R&B and soul was being played all over the state. And so I grew up listening to that, hearing him play that stuff and learning tunes and just everything from old Stax, Otis Redding, to Motown, to Earth, Wind & Fire, and Tower Power, and some funk stuff. So while a lot of other kids were listening to early 80s, whatever, Debbie Gibson and whatnot, that was in there too, obviously, because you got to go to school and all that. But there was a balance between that in my life, which I'm really grateful for, because I grew up on like Run DMC and Curtis Blow and a lot of early 80s hip-hop and all that good stuff, and some metal and all this stuff. But I always had this root of classic soul music and funk and R&B. And then eventually, when I started my group in college, Mingo Fishtrap, after a few years, Pops he had a heart failure, actually, due to like a thyroid condition. Some weird stuff went down. And so basically, he was at the end of his recovery, and we hadn't spent a lot of time together while I was in school. So he came to visit, and through some bizarre circumstances, we needed someone to sit in on bass. And he ended up sitting in on like 3 or 4 songs on this awards show that we had to do. And then within 6 weeks' time or so after that, he was a member of the band, and we played together for, 16, 17 years.
What year was that he joined?
That's a really good question. I want to say like 97-ish.
Wow.
Something like that, maybe 98. Yeah, somewhere in that time period, and was with the group until a couple years ago, 2.5 years ago or so he retired. So it was cool. It was very cool having, it's weird when you have to work with family, but it's also a blessing. So,
well, apparently it was pretty good if you went that 17 years.
Oh, absolutely.
Did you grow up in Louisiana then, for the most part?
No, my folks separated when I was 5, and so I was born in Mississippi and kind of bounced between Mississippi and Louisiana. When my folks were separated, we ended up in Dallas for a few years. She remarried. Guy ended up being an Air Force pilot, so I moved all over the country after that. By the time I was kind of halfway through elementary school, I was up in, I was California for a while, Nebraska for a while, Michigan for several years, and then eventually landed back in Texas, down in Houston area, while I finished high school, and then went to school up at UNT in Denton for music.
That's where you got all the massive talent.
Well, that's where they put your feet to the fire for sure. It's all about the quality of the student body. I mean, it's really more about that than it is about the staff, although obviously they're some of the best out there. But what I didn't expect when I got there, I think a lot of people probably did, but I wasn't. I was never going to be a jazz guy. Like, that was probably beyond my ability, and definitely beyond my desire to practice for 12 hours a day. I realized when I was like kind of in my late teens, and I was started to get into all these groups and like Little Feat and Tower Power, groups that they had some commercial successes and they were relatable to a layperson. It wasn't like you had to have this crazy theoretical knowledge to understand them, but the palette was wider. That's what I love about Stevie Wonder. His palette was so wide in terms of what he's able to do, and it was still commercially successful. It was still successful in terms of being able to connect with someone. It's just, so I knew I needed to learn that stuff and be able to speak that language, even if I wasn't going to be playing quote unquote jazz or bebop or whatever else. Being able to speak that language and know what I was talking about and all that good stuff would have been a good idea. So that's why I ended up there. And I'm super, super grateful for my time there. I wish I would have known while I was there that not all of life is like that. When you're 18 years old and you get to this place and I could walk 40 feet from my dorm room and I could hear the 1 o'clock lab band, right? These are the guys that went on to become the best. Like, half of them have Grammys or are related to projects that have Grammy. That's every day you can see that stuff. And we did. We saw it all the time. We saw it all around town. And I didn't realize at the time just how special that was. I'm super grateful that at least part of me was paying attention.
Yeah, I mentioned, I think before we hit record, that I spent a lot of years in Arlington, and I started playing music in Arlington. I did not go to UNT, but I saw so many fantastic musicians, and I'm a drummer, so I saw all these fantastic drummers, of course, and kind of learned just by watching those guys, and clearly, or I was very intimidated by them, but they were so inspiring. And then later I met and worked with a guy years later who went to Berkeley in Boston, and I mentioned UNT, and it was the first time someone had told me, like, oh yeah, that's a really incredible school. And this was a guy who graduated from Berkeley, and he said everybody knows that there's really great players coming out of there all the time. What a great place to be.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, that's half of the band did their undergrad at UNT. The keyboard player did his undergrad at Berkeley, and a couple of guys did their grad work at UNT. So we're all a bunch of nerds. But yeah, and it's funny because I think it's great to have that. I'm not going to downplay the importance of having the education, but really, honestly, I remember the first day of like orientation there. Fred Hamilton, who was at the time the head of the guitar and bass department for the jazz studies group, hugely respected dude. And basically he came in, and I'm sure I'm paraphrasing to some degree here, but he came into this room full of incoming freshmen for the most part, like just scared shitless. He basically said, if you want to play jazz, you should just go lock yourself in the attic and play Longer records for the next 4 years. And then basically walked away. And he's probably right. Like, if that's literally all you want to do, if you're going to go 100% for that and you have no interest in maybe the arranging stuff or any kind of education stuff or whatever else, then, obviously that's a proven route as well. So it's not like, I don't think you have to go to music school. And I didn't finish music school. I didn't finish school. I was there long enough to, but I was College of Arts and Sciences and didn't realize I needed a bunch of language. So by the time I found that out, I was like, well, I'm not going to spend any more money on this. In terms of my professional life, I don't think it would have made too much of a difference to me, just because I wasn't going to be going into education. That probably wasn't something I had the temperament for or the skill set for. And I don't know that it made a lot of difference. And I think there are quite a few folks that kind of go to these schools, Berkeley, UNT, that you either think you know everything and you get there and you're like, holy crap, I don't know anything. You spend however much time you have to spend there to get your legs underneath you where you're off and running. And then you spend the next 10 years developing whatever skill set you've either been blessed with or you've developed into something that hopefully people want to hear. And if you're going to be a performer, the degree, I'm not going to downplay it, but I just don't know that it has too much. The education itself is far more important than the piece of paper, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Because like what I was saying before was just as important as sitting in those rooms and hearing somebody either lecture or whatever the case may be in class, going out to TJ's Pizza on Tuesday nights and hearing guys who now have shelves full of awards play in the corner for free beer was just as important. It really was. It was just as important to have that that time early on to see what good really looked like and sounded like, and to know, at least from your own perspective, that's what you're going to be comparing yourself to. I wish I could have gone back and told my young self, you need to take this all in right now at this moment and compare yourself and everything you do to the very best that you can hear, because that's reality. And I'm not suggesting like whether it's a technical prowess or whatever else. I'm just saying that if they're making a connection to the audience from whatever capacity it is, and obviously they're playing for a bunch of nerds, so it's different. It's different. We were all nerds.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I think that that's the testament to how well you're doing. So are you making the connection that you intended to make? I didn't really think about those things back then, but luckily my memory hasn't slipped enough to completely forget them. So trying to apply them later in life, you know?
Yeah, it's the nature of being, isn't it? I keep little reminders come up in life about trying to soak it all in, and I'm constantly, every time that happens, I have those moments too. I think of this, I'm going to forget the title now, this song by the Flaming Lips. I think it's called Do You Realize? He sort of just talks about how quickly life goes by. Yeah, of course, we don't really think about it so much in the moment, but it's certainly a nice thing to reflect on from time to time, to give ourselves a little push to think about it. I want to talk about Mingo Fishtrap for a little bit more. So you started it in college in the mid to late 90s?
Mid 90s would be giving me a couple years on it, because I think we actually started this band. The very first time it was ever on a marquee was probably like 92 or 93. I say marquee. That's also a fancier word than it ought to be. A flyer. Basically, we started there. We lived in Bruce Hall. I say we. Bruce Hall is where was the dormitory that is kind of the music dorm there. And at that time, there was no AC. This is in Texas, for those of you that don't know.
That's harsh for those of you who don't know.
It's a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea. But, music dorm kind of came last, I think. After a semester of kind of being thrown into this very, very different world, musically and socially and everything else, I was very much missing hearing some of the tunes that I would hear. But, I could spend my summers with my dad, and I would go on these gigs with him. So as I got to be 16, 17 years old in college, I would go out to these gigs and get a pretty good taste. At least 20, 30 shows a year, I'd get to go out and hear this soul music and R&B and whatnot played by really good players. And I hadn't had that in like close to a year, I guess, and missed having it. So I was like, hey, man, just like anybody else, just sitting at the dorm cafeteria. Hey, you want to start a band? That's the thing. That's literally the thing. And here I am many years later, and started with just dorm mates. And you just happen to be in a place where you could throw a rock and hit somebody who could really play their stuff. So we went through many different folks in the first couple of years. The only gigs, quote unquote gigs, that we had were just local. Like we played, the very first thing we did was called the Bruce Jam. It was in the dorm. That's why the band's named what it was, because like a week before this, I had blown a tire on my very sketchy full-size diesel Bronco, which I had no business owning. And I was looking for a spare. And in the phone book, which was at the time the only map that I owned, in the front of the phone book, which it's not at all an accurate map. It's not what you want to go to if you really need to find something. And there was supposed to be this junkyard out close to the intersection of Mingo and Fishtrap Roads, which is just outside of town in Denton. So can't even remember if I ever found this place or not, but a week later, there was a sign up, just this literally a sign up sheet in the dorm for sign up your band for Bruce Jam. The only qualification, you didn't have to be a play, it was just somebody in the band live, in Bruce Hall. And we didn't have a band. I didn't have a band. I wrote the name down, Mingo Fishtrap, and then proceeded to sit at the cafeteria table and go, hey, you want to play in a band? Hey, you want to play in a band? Got enough players, and we just did some Otis Redding and some Wilson Pickett. I think we may have done some Blood, Sweat, and Tears, maybe a Tower Power song, and played this little 30-minute set, and people went apeshit because there wasn't a whole lot of that going around at the time. And then right in this same window, a bunch of bands kind of blew up locally. I don't know. It depends on when you were hanging out in Arlington. You may have heard some of these.
Yeah. Tell me go ahead. Who are they?
Well, Beef Jerky was, these band names are going to sound ludicrous now in retrospect, but Beef Jerky was amazing funk, kind of hip hop, funk live band. This was the way in Denton. It was like half guys that were just from town, that lived in town, and half UNT guys So you get this really cool dichotomy of kind of a punk attitude and then guys who were looking to write stuff that wasn't run of the mill, like really nerds. So Beef Jerky was a very good example of that. Amazing rhythm section. A guy named Eric Delegard, who owns a studio, still owns a studio in Denton, was playing bass. Danny Handler was on drums. Just all these guys who we looked up to, some guys from the 1 o'clock horn section. They were the first band we opened for at this place called Rick's Place, which is right on the corner of Fry Street, and I'm not even sure, just basically right on campus. That was our first legit gig. And, it was a sold out thing. It was 500 people there and packing this club, and we did our thing and it went over. And so luckily we just had this community, this cool community of bands and clubs there in town. And obviously we didn't have to depend on anything. We didn't have to make any money. That's the big thing that I think we started so young. First of all, some people had financial aid coming in.
Yeah.
But more importantly, we just lived in just crappy house. By the time we moved out of the dorms, we lived in a house that cost $450 a month for a 3-bedroom house. How? The whole thing. Even at that time, that was dirt cheap. And so basically we had to play one decent gig a month to pay all the expenses for our life. And having that time, I think, to kind of try to find the intersection of 3 things. What do you want to do? What do you do well enough? And then what will people pay you to do? If you can find the intersection of those 3 things, and that's great. You found something that you can strive for, I think. And that gave us time, I think. It gave me time to do that. Of course, I can't bear to listen to anything we did at the time back then. But you change, you morph. So at the time, I think that was a real blessing. Yeah. And just having that time to naturally grow, naturally find what stuff you want. It was a really weird time for music, too. It was like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, all this stuff would come in. But then you had Dave Matthews Band come out of nowhere. You're like, wow, what's that? And that was all on the radio at the same time. So it was an interesting time. And locally, we had bands like Mushroom Groovy and Whitey was a crazy band. And
Whitey.
Yeah. Bass X was a killer live hip hop group. There were probably like over a dozen groups that stylistically, they may have been, now you would probably put them in completely different clubs. But at the time, these are all college age kids, and Rick's Place had everything. Rick's Place would have Reverend Horton Heat one night, then Trippin' Daisy the next night, then Funk the next night, and then Deep Blue something. Then, so it was a crazy, diverse scene, and everybody was pretty accepting. So all those things kind of came together to give us a nice fertile ground to experiment and not have a lot of the adult responsibility.
Well, that's another good reason to go to a good music school, to be able to witness all those kind of things. But yeah, I was around I know of or remember a few of those bands that you mentioned. I was not really, my ears were not so privy to like soul and R&B at the time, but so I was still probably kind of coming off of like new wave and the post-punk stuff. And
you remember Hagfish then?
Yes, yeah.
Those guys, Bowling for Soup?
Yeah.
Bowling for Soup moved into our house when we moved away from Denton.
I'll be done.
Those guys. So we've known those guys since the very, very beginning, and we played. This is how diverse the scene was. We would play shows opening for Hagfish. Like stylistically, it made no sense, but people didn't care. It was a cool scene. Rubber Gloves was just kind of getting rolling when we moved away. I don't know if you know Rubber Gloves, but they were like super into the punk scene there. I don't even know if they're still going, but
no, I didn't know them. And what's funny is I had until somewhat recently a notebook for a number of years that had a Hagfish sticker on it. It was my lyrics book.
Nice.
That's funny. Oh,
no, we sound old. But,
yeah, I know.
But I am super, super grateful to have gone through that whole close to a decade of my life, really. I mean, obviously a lot changed within that decade, but when you're 18, that's a really, really long time. When you're 18, it's a third of your life. If you started 18 and you're there, I was in Denton until 99. So I was there for like 8.5 years based in Denton. And I guess if there's somebody really young that's looking to be a performing artist, looking to write, I don't know how I could have done it otherwise. If I would have been like, oh man, this place sucks and I need a nice apartment with nice things, never would have happened. I never would be a musician right now. At best, I'd be doing studio stuff, which is fine, and that's all fine, but that's the reality. You have to keep your costs super low. You have to have roommates. You have to do this stuff. And that stuff lends itself to that creative environment. When you have other people, like-minded people around you, whether they're in your group, quote unquote, or not, I think that's what you have to do. And obviously, I'm not like hanging around colleges. That'd be kind of creepy these days. But it seems like maybe that's not the MO anymore for a lot of college kids. Everybody's got an apartment. Here in Austin, it's just crazy expensive. And I think that's a wrong way to do it. If you're immediately worried about making a $2,500 a month nut when you're 18 or 19, or even when you're 21, and you're looking to be a performer, like you're looking to play music as your main thing, there's so many time compromises you have to put up with, right?
Yeah.
You have to go get a job at Olive Garden. That time is your most valuable resource. Forever, time is the most valuable resource.
Yep.
So, I mean, I like to have nice stuff like everybody else, but if it's more important to you to play music, then keep your costs low, which is something they did not teach at UNT. And I've kind of always held a bit of a sore spot about that program for not having any more business courses for musicians to take. It's a super important lesson is to keep your costs low. You have to in order to do this. And when you get successes, that's great. Be smart with your money. But man, I think a lot of kids just don't know that going in.
Now, Roger, you and I are here today to educate the kids.
For the children. It really is important to me because I see, and I talk to and I produce some younger folks. I don't mean just high school kids and 18-year-olds. I'm talking about people that are well into their 20s. If you're 25 and you've already racked up $30,000 in credit card debt plus your student loans and those shit, the chances of you being able to dedicate the kind of resource and time, mostly time, to building anything that's remotely sustainable. And I'm not talking about this like I'm Kanye. I've got a band that is sustainable. My business has been sustainable. I'm 45 years old right now, and I've somehow eked out something that's been sustainable and that I've paid most of my bills for most of my life with this. And a lot of it has to do with how we started. A lot of it, regardless of any talent level or finding what people might like that I or our band can do. Beyond all that stuff, without that pad at the beginning to get some momentum going, I hesitate to think what it would have been like had I had one day gig that I took in that time period. I worked for Apple, and that was a cool gig. And it's not worth talking about, but some things changed. I went to a different company, and the time, that resource of time disappeared for me. And if it meant going from playing 1 gig a month or 2 gigs a month down to playing 1 gig every 3 months, that means a lot. There's a big difference between developing songs and a set list and a show and just finding what you're good at. Man, it requires time. And it's the most difficult thing now in my life. So I don't think it ever changes, but luckily we had the momentum to get us to a place. But it's the same thing now. In order to get a new record together, in order to get rehearsals together, to work out new material, work out new show stuff, whatever it might be, the most difficult thing is finding time. And the higher your nut, the higher your expenses are, the less time you're going to have to dedicate.
Yeah, the less freedom you'll have to make it. You guys strike me, and you reinforced it, I think, in the things you just said, but you guys being Mingo Fishtrap strike me as really big on performing live. It looks like you play a lot of festivals.
Mm-hmm.
And not everyone I talk to on the show, a lot of people I talk to are arguably more focused on songwriting, or depending on where they're at, when I catch them too, they may be recording or creating. And I know that you're doing a mix of those things, but can you talk a little bit about the live performance aspect of what you and the band does? And also a little bit, if you can, touch on how you've been so active in festivals and what it means for you guys.
Sure. I'll just put a blanket over it all, which is nothing at all happened overnight. There wasn't one decision that I made or that we made as a group that propelled us single-handedly into being able to do quite a few fests and stuff. It was definitely a question of developing relationships over time with buyers and eventually having an agency or agencies that they could rely on you for what they need. So for me, it's difficult because I do love sitting in the studio. I do love creating, producing records. I love writing. I have tons of songs. But the financial reality is it's very difficult to, in a band situation in particular, to make any kind of profit off of album sales, right? These days, everybody knows that. Again, we're kind of lucky because we got in at a good time where we have decent number of Spotify plays. Those kind of things like digital sales and Spotify can probably, if I sat down, it would probably pay for itself, maybe. Like it would pay for studio time or new gear that we need or this or that. Doesn't really pay for the time you sat and wrote. It doesn't really pay for your bills. It just kind of sustains itself. Beyond that, the physical sales of CDs at shows help to run our business, but they don't really put any profit in anybody's pocket. If you take a decent local act and you make, let's say, you've been playing for a couple of years, and you can go in and you can get 60 hard ticket sales at $10, right? And you get 80% of that. That's probably more money than you're going to make in 4 months selling albums off of iTunes or CDs or Spotify, right? I mean, it correlates. Unless you get a placement or, there's something extraordinary about it. If it's just a organic, homegrown thing, then you're never going to make per hour spent. You're never going to make on a local level or regional level the kind of money you make live selling CDs or selling records, selling downloads. I don't think it's true for anybody. I would love to hear someone who was true for the folks that primarily are focused on selling their songs, like getting publishing deals. That's a totally different world. If you're looking to be a performing artist, the reality is it's very much a matter of multiple streams of income, right? So for us, the primary is definitely live. We can do one show, one good festival, one. We'll pay the same or more than we will make on album sales for a year. And we do all right on record sales. But if you can get into the $10,000 range for a fest, I mean, if you produce your record yourself, maybe you can make $8 per album, right? Maybe. You got to cover your costs. But are you going to sell 1,200 in a year? I don't think most people do. 1 million Spotify plays wouldn't cover that. Before I go on, I'm not trying to be negative about it all. I think it's all very doable. But when you play live, it's a totally different thing that you're bringing into the marketplace. Totally different thing. I don't think most people, obviously there's some that do, but I don't think most people are record collectors like they used to be. There's not, even into the 90s, I think it's not like ancient, but I think even into the 90s, you could sell records to people that never heard your band. That was a definite possibility. And now you can maybe get them to listen to you if they've never seen your band on Spotify. If you get lucky, you get on a playlist that kind of goes beyond the scope of just your fan base. But that's all its own thing. If your goal is to, we got to get more fans, we got to get more people listening to our thing, that's a business. That's a job. That is its own job. And you can do it. But again, it's a matter of resource. It's a matter of time that you have to spend. So you either have to give up money and pay somebody, pay a label, or pay a buddy to sit and just try to get you more folks on Instagram or Facebook or whatever it might be, wherever you might find your digital audience, or you do it yourself and you give up that time. So for me, partially to my chagrin, it's much easier, like logarithmically either, exponentially easier to make the money we need to make to survive as a band, for the band and the business of the band to continue through playing live shows. I mean, if I'm paying my guys $30 a night, how long is that going to last? It's not going to last. So I have to strive for that. And in order to do that, in the long run, you have to love it. It can't just be something that you do because you have to promote this record. Like if you really want to write songs, that's your main thing, being in the studio writing songs, that's your thing. Don't try to be a performer. That's ridiculous. You'd be wasting all your time. I love being in front of an audience. I love making that connection live. I love it just as much as I do sitting in the studio. It fulfills something different within me. And if you really enjoy it, if you really want to make that connection and you really want to take that audience someplace, I think that's the main goal. All of the kind of logistics and the putting together set lists and putting together show stuff and all that stuff comes together because of the drive to make the connection, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So because of the nature of our band, playing soul music and funk and having horn section, and I'm an idiot, so I dance around a bunch. The nature of that, I think, is if we do our jobs well enough, if even if we're like kind of doing it all right, that's a pretty good type of band to have on fests. So just getting specific about our situation, I think the first few festivals that we played that were kind of regional were based, either we were just sending out tons of packets, like back in the day, literally putting CD and picture and bio and all this crap into an envelope and sending it to these promoters or booking agents, or probably to many of the wrong places, they just end up on the trash pile. Sending out tons of them, like 100 for every maybe 2 or 3 responses we'd get. Again, time. And so then it catches on. If you do a good job, if you do the job that you were hired to do, which for us on a festival, it's this two ways. There's either you're a good hard ticket sale, right? So in our world that we like to be in terms of kind of idiom or whatever else, we do a lot of stuff in the jam band scene. And if you put Lettuce or you put Galactic or you put any band like that on a fest, that's a hard ticket sale. People will go to that festival specifically to see that band. They'll pay the ticket price specifically to see that band, same way they would if they were playing a theater, if they were playing any kind of venue. And we have maybe a little bit of that depending on the market. But then there's a band like us, I think more than that for us, where the buyer or the promoter or whoever knows that we can come in and keep an audience entertained and keep them engaged before that band comes on. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That may not sound like the dream. You know what I mean? Like everybody would rather have fans, but we can do that well because I really love doing it. I really, the challenge of these people have no idea what we're about to do. They don't know any song we're about to play probably. They don't know anything about us. They don't even know the name of the band maybe. And we have to get them. And you have to get them in like a minute. If you don't get them in a minute, it's over. Screwed. They're not going to give you a second chance. So I love that challenge. And we took it on early, and we do these fests we were fifth down or we were sixth down. We were early in the day, in the middle of the afternoon. And you just go out and you try to kill it. I mean, there's definitely a little bit of, especially earlier on, this bit of a chip on your shoulder, like you got something to prove. Obviously, it's not a competition, and it never should be, but to yourself, you want to prove to yourself that you're worthy of these people's time as an entertainer and as a musician. And I guess we were good enough to get a bit of momentum. And eventually you get more money. And if you're smart about the way you handle your business, you can hold off on taking some of the gigs that maybe won't be so great for your particular thing. I think it's a mistake a lot of bands have made. We made that mistake many, many times. And you can just take the ones that make sense for what it is you're trying to accomplish, whether that just be making lots of money or whether it's actually developing and following an audience. And if you play 10,000 people and 1% of those people like you, that's a pretty damn good day in terms of like building your hard following, your hard ticket sale following, and your people that are going to connect with you on socials and follow what it is you're creating and make that connection for hopefully forever. So it's been an efficient way for us to develop a fan base. But the flip side is we had to be good in that spot. If you get up and you play mostly like mid-tempo ballads, you're probably not going to get the gig next time, even if you're brilliant. It's just that's not the scene. Luckily for us, what we do musically works in that scene.
This is great stuff. I think that people hearing everything you've said today are really going to find a lot of value in it. So tell me if I get any of this wrong. I want to be respectful of your time, so I want to mention a couple things here, but your Mingo Fishtrap's latest release is on time?
Yep, that's correct.
You can find it on all of the usual places where you can stream and purchase on iTunes or Amazon, and on mingofishtrap.com, correct?
Yes, sir. Sounds right.
Yeah, and there I see that you guys have all of they can find you everywhere from the website.
Yeah, all the usual spots, iTunes and Amazon and Spotify and all that crap.
Yeah. So there was so much I wanted to talk about. I'll likely hit you up with some follow-up questions. And for any of you who are listening to this, which will be a little way down the road from the day that we're actually recording, if you have questions for Roger that you'd like me to ask him, and let me know, and maybe he can find a little time
yeah, of course.
to answer that. And Roger, I want to thank you again for coming on. It's been a real pleasure. I legitimately love your music, the band's music.
Oh, man. Thank you, brother.
Yeah, you guys sound fantastic. I'm looking forward to featuring a track at the end of the episode so people can hear it. And man, keep doing what you're doing, and I hope that we'll stay in touch. I've told a few of your neighbors there that I need to get to Austin, so when I do, I hope that we can get together for a cup of coffee or whatever floats your boat.
Always up for some Joe, man. Appreciate it.
All right, Roger. Thanks. Be cool.
Where the grass is greener, the sugar sweeter when she come around. But my tongue gets tied 'cause I'm a little shy and the words just can't be found. And I need a bit of encouragement to hit that shooting star. Up to my lip and just a little nip off that magic mason jar. That magic mason jar. Magic Mason John. Magic Mason John. Oh no. I ain't never run like a Billy done when they caught him in the wood. Well, he ran till he fell down, was sitting a spell and said he make more when he could. But a friend of mine down on County Line got a sister to Billy dated, and she's selling the stairs for some bell broadcast. So I gladly up and paid her. Oh, that Magic Mason John.
Hey, thanks again for listening. The Unstarving Musicians podcast is edited for sound and content quality by Juan Perez. The intro-outro track is Alarm Clocks, written and performed by Redwood. That's me on drums. Be sure to visit the show notes for this and any other episode for links and exclusive tidbits and offers. You can find them at unstarvingmusician.com/podcast. Lastly, visit unstarvingmusician.com/resources for cool stuff that I personally use and or recommend to my fellow musicians and artistic types. With much gratitude, peace, love, and more cowbell.